The year is 2001, and when the original Xbox was released, people quickly realized the media center potential of the console. A media center that you could use in the living room where you could play or stream DivX or Xvid encoded content was an expensive and complicated proposition, and for some reason, Microsoft completely overlooked the potential of the Xbox as a living room media device. Maybe they were too focused on the games. Once the original Xbox was modded, people quickly went to work on development of a media player. The early efforts were the genesis of what would become Xbox Media Center, or XBMC, which incidentally is now known as Kodi, which is available for just about every single device you could think of. XBMC on the Xbox was one of the most downloaded and most used homebrew applications. With regular updates, new codecs introduced, it was a fantastic piece of software. Many people still use XBMC as their default dashboard, and why not? It was packed with features. The original Xbox has its limitations, however. With only 64 megabytes of memory and a single-core 733 MHz processor, it meant some of the emerging 720p high-def content would struggle and in many cases would not work at all. The Xbox had met its match, and even with the optimizations the XBMC development team were adding to the codebase, it simply didn't have the processing power necessary to deliver 720p video content at full frame rates. But a little-known company known as FriendTech hoped to change all that. FriendTech was established in 1987 as a PC motherboard manufacturer, and in 1994 they switched from motherboards to CPU upgrade products. With many years of experience underneath them, they saw the potential market the Xbox could provide in the living room and as a media center, and they launched a range of Xbox console upgrades that would turbocharge an original Xbox to speeds that were unheard of at the time. So, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the FriendTech DreamX 1480, see how well it performs with emulation, homebrew, games, as well as Xbox Media Center and playing 720p video content. Does it still slow down and stutter as much as the original Xbox does? Well, let's go ahead and find out. The FriendTech DreamX 1480 is a standard Xbox but with two major upgrades. Memory has been upgraded from 64 to 128 megabytes of RAM, and the CPU has been upgraded from 733 MHz to an Intel Tualatin processor clocked at 1.48 GHz. In order to maintain compatibility, a switch is mounted on the front of the case to switch between normal speeds and the 1.48 GHz mode. Normal speed, however, is clocked at 740 MHz versus 733 MHz and can cause some compatibility issues even with that small difference. In order to take advantage of the additional memory, the Xbox needs to be modded, so there is a mod chip installed for this reason. So as I opened up the Xbox in order to tear it down and get a closer look internally, I realized I had forgotten to take care of something very important, something that potentially could destroy my system. Okay, so I know what some of you guys are thinking. Why is the clock capacitor still on this motherboard? And that's a great question. So what we're going to go ahead and do is remove the clock capacitor from the motherboard and clean up any of the leakage that is on the motherboard and neutralize it with baking soda and some distilled water in order to ensure we don't get any additional erosion of the motherboard. And the next thing we're going to do is remove the heat sinks off the CPU and GPU, clean off the thermal paste and reapply new Arctic Silver thermal paste in order to make sure our CPU and GPU is as cool as possible. And it's especially important with the FriendTech 1.4 GHz because these CPUs tend to get hotter because they run a lot faster than a stock Xbox. And as you can see, that's the damage that the clock capacitor has caused. So it's very, very important that you do remove them as soon as possible. If you do get a old Xbox, original Xbox, make sure that you remove this as quickly as possible. As you can see, it's definitely caused some damage, but we're going to go ahead and clean this up. So before we do anything, let's check our temperatures. Loading up XBMC, we see that our temperatures are normal around 130 degrees. Now you're probably thinking that this is quite high, but as mentioned, the CPU runs much hotter than a stock Xbox CPU. I ran through a few different games and emulators and temperatures don't spike much higher than 130 degrees, so this is a good sign. Obviously I prefer much cooler temperatures, but the only other real option here is water cooling. And I've had this system since 2004 and my temperatures have never been an issue with stability. And it's also interesting to note that the clock speed that Xbox Media Center is reporting is suggesting that it's running over 1.5 GHz. This is 20 MHz higher than the advertised clock speed, and this is a welcome addition. I'm not really sure why the system appears to be running faster than advertised, but hey, I'll take it. FriendTech advertised the DreamX 1480 to be the ultimate media center console at the time, so let's put that to the test. A 720p video render at 1.48 GHz indeed runs much smoother than the stock Xbox, but it's not perfect. There are still some drop frames here and there that occur, but overall this is a much smoother experience. So what about emulators and homebrew? Well, first of all, with the extra 128 MB of memory and additional processing power, it means we can play some homebrew that pushes the CPU, like this Quake 2 port. When you use an 800x600 screen mode on a standard Xbox, it starts to get a little jerky, but on a 1.4 GHz Xbox, it maintains a smooth frame rate. This recent homebrew port of Half-Life to the Xbox also takes advantage of the extra memory and power of the FriendTech CPU and delivers an almost locked 60 frames per second experience. Moving on to emulators, Killer Instinct 2 by Midway on the Xbox was something that could never quite pull off 60 frames per second. But as soon as you flick that switch to the turbo setting on the FriendTech, it runs as smooth as butter at a locked 60 frames. Impressive stuff. Okay, so what about other arcade games? If you watched my Nintendo Switch homebrew video, I mentioned that one of the more taxing arcade games is R-Type Leo by Irem. As you can see on a standard Xbox running Final Burn Legends, we're barely pushing 35 frames per second with lots of stutter and slowdown. But flick over to the turbo mode on the FriendTech and it's a 60 frames per second smooth experience with zero slowdown whatsoever. Emulation is really where the FriendTech starts to come into its own. So let's talk about game compatibility. This one can be a little hit and miss. Many games load and play exactly the same as a stock Xbox, but in some instances the extra power of the FriendTech console helps with some games in areas where they normally would slow down. But in many games I tested, they simply run too fast, even in the standard 740 MHz mode. Breakdown, for example, is unplayable, as is Rally Sport Challenge 2. FriendTech even acknowledged this by downgrading the game compatibility from excellent to just fine, so there's definitely a trade-off between power and compatibility. There is a solution, however, and one that I've tried and works quite well. The program known as 1400 MHz Patcher will change a few bytes in the Xbox executable or XBE and will allow the game to run on a FriendTech or upgraded system with a more powerful CPU. It works quite well with everything that I've tried with it so far. It does, however, mean you can't just pop a disc in the Xbox DVD drive and play as you normally would. You will need to rip the game onto your hard disk and then patch the executable. So there's definitely more work involved here if you need to play games. But the FriendTech DreamX 1480 was never meant to maintain 100% compatibility in the first place. Its main purpose was for media, homebrew and emulation, and in these areas it does a fantastic job. Everything works as advertised. It's definitely an interesting piece of hardware and one that I'm truly happy owning as part of my collection. Well guys, that'll do it for this video. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. Now before I go, I want to mention that I did do a FriendTech video about 4 years ago when I was kind of a noob at YouTube. So I will leave it in a card up here. So check that video out if you are wanting to see more FriendTech stuff. It's not a very good video, but at least you get some more idea of where my head was at, you know, back 4 years ago when I was making videos. But of course, guys, let me know in the comments below if you have any questions about this video or anything else. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.